All right, well, it's good to be here. My talk was supposed to be at 3:30, and I just got off a plane like 50 minutes ago from Paris, so I'm feeling great. So I can't hear anything right now, so raise your hand if you have a question, interrupt me, whatever. This is a fun talk. So this is not a technical talk. I'm not even talking about Appium. I'm talking about something else. So I'm talking about how to make your mobile app automatable. So I find that people want to do mobile automation, but one of the key problems I see with people is that what they're trying to automate is the main obstacle to them succeeding. So I thought I'd put together this talk on what you can do to create an environment under which mobile automation can thrive. So back to me, like he said, I created Appium. I'm head of development at a company called FOODit in London. Previously, I managed the QA organization at Shazam and at Zoosk. And then a long time ago, I worked on Office and went to computer science school and all that stuff. So I've kind of broken it down into a couple of key components. I'm going to start with defining your automation culture for your company or for your product. I think this is the most important thing you can do to help your apps or your automation efforts succeed. Then I'm going to talk about how to make all the pieces of your user interface accessible. Accessibility and automatability are the same thing, which is great. So you're doing two things. You're making your product better for those who need assistive devices, and you're making it easier for developers who want to automate your app. Then I'm going to talk about making your large scenarios more efficient, and then sort of planning for concurrency. So you're all at SauceCon, so you're all probably interested in concurrency. So we're going to talk a bit about that as well. So this is a not very technical talk, but there will be a few code snippets in there. So don't worry if you don't code. There's plenty of stuff for you. So first, I want to talk about the culture and how test automation fits into your development cycle. So there's many things you need to ask yourself. Who's going to write your tests? What will you automate and what won't you automate? When will the tests be written? What is the stack for the tests? How will you track your results? And how will maintenance work on all this? And I'm going to dive into each of these because they're each very important. So I'd like to start off with who's going to write your tests. So in my opinion, as someone who manages developers for a living, I like to have these guys write the tests. They don't like to write the tests, but I like to have them write the tests. And I feel like there's several reasons for that. One is that they're intimately familiar with the product, so they know it better than even the product manager most of the time because they're the ones that developed it. The other side of the coin is that because they have other things, and developers tend to think of themselves being evaluated as to what software they produce in a certain time period as opposed to the quality of the software in a more holistic view, sometimes you struggle with having things get deprioritized or not get done when you assign things to developers. There's also the idea that automation engineers could write it. I am less keen on this, but it is a valid strategy. And here are the kind of things I find that come up with it. How do you ensure that you're actually going to fix the product? I find often when you have a team of automation engineers, you deal with that issue of trying to get the development team to try and fix the bug. And maybe that takes longer than you'd like, and you end up changing the test just so it won't fail, or you end up just changing the test at all or getting rid of it. So you sort of have that conflict of interest where if you have a developer, for them it's all the same. I can fix the product, I can fix the test, doesn't matter. I'm not beholden to anyone. Whereas an automation engineer who doesn't work on product code, they need to go get a developer to actually fix something. I also find that the code falls out of sync with the product code for the same reason. Because you have people writing the product and people writing the tests for the product, sometimes they don't talk to one another, and you end up with tests that aren't valid for the product, or vice versa, products that have surpassed the tests, and so on. And then lastly, how do you maintain the code quality here? So there are many great automation engineers out there, and then there are some that aren't, who don't produce good code quality. And so I find that that's often a struggle when you hire automation-only people. There are a lot of great automation-only people out there, but trying to get all of them on your organization is very difficult. If anyone here is an automation engineer that writes good code, yeah, you're in high demand. You have no trouble getting a job.
No, I was going to say one way that we solve the answer to all three of those questions is my automation engineer team is working in
Yeah, I will second that. I think that's a great idea. And let's keep this interactive, so feel free to jump in like he just did and share your thoughts. But I totally agree with that. I don't think separate code bases ever really work for this sort of thing. And I agree with the benefits. And then lastly, there's some crazy people out there that have the product managers write the automated tests. Where are you cucumber people? I'm not even going to dignify that with any further explanation. But it is a choice you have. So anyways, the second question to ask yourself about your automation culture is, what are we going to automate? And you need to think about the cost versus the benefit, right? So because we have tools like Selenium and Appium, there's this tendency to want to automate everything at the end-to-end level. I think a lot of it derives from the upper management gets some sort of satisfaction out of seeing the product actually click and do that sort of thing. But you have to realize that those sorts of tests are the most flaky, they require the most maintenance, the most upkeep, and they take the longest to run. So I find you should use them sparingly, and you should augment and supplement them with a good, healthy diet of unit testing. The way we draw the line where I work now is that we have the end-to-end tests, touch every single piece of UI once, and then we handle all the configurations, edge cases, and unit tests and integration tests. And we find that works really well for us. You can, I'm sure Sauce would love it if you end-to-end automated absolutely every scenario in your app. That would make them a lot of money, but some of us have finite budgets and finite amount of time. So yes, like I said, don't automate everything. And I guess another point is there are certain things that humans just do better than computers. So with an automated test, you're only going to find the bugs you're looking for. With a human, you're going to find all sorts of things that you probably weren't looking for, which is good and bad, but often good. So another thing you should think about with your automation culture is, when will you write the test? So you sort of have three choices. You have before the product is written, sort of the TDD approach, write the tests, make them pass, you have a product. In this case, who defines the tests is kind of a question you might want to answer. There's also the option of doing it simultaneously alongside the regular product code. But you need things in place to make this happen in parallel. So if your organization is going to choose this strategy, you need to make sure that there's a clear set of requirements from the people writing the tests to the people writing the product code and vice versa, so that you can do this. And then there's the last option I'll throw up there, which is after the product code is written. So unlike previous things I've thrown out there, I think each of these strategies can and will work depending on what kind of product cycle you have. I've worked in places with TDD that worked amazingly well, and I've worked in places where the tests were the absolute last thing written and it worked really well. And I think it just depends on how your business works and how it wants to deliver software. So in my case, we had a very agile product that we didn't know what we were writing. 80–90% of what we wrote was A/B tests. So we threw away 90% of the code we wrote because after a week, the customers didn't want it. It didn't increase whatever metric it was supposed to. So it would be quite silly to then front load all the tests, because tests are good for regression. And if you're going to get rid of the thing, you don't need to regress it. So it's a very good case for having a manual QA just look at it and make sure it doesn't break. And then once you know you're actually going to have to maintain that feature going forward, you can add in the regression suite. That being said, test-driven development is a great approach as well. And when you have something where you absolutely know what it's going to do in advance, that can be a very beneficial approach. So the point of what I'm talking about is more, depending on how your organization works, think about when you're going to write the tests and bake that into your automation culture. Another important question is, what stack will you use for your tests? So what language will you write them in? So there's kind of a few choices here. The same as the application is a choice. And I find that that's often the best choice. When you have it in the same language you write the product in, you tend to get more participation from the people writing the product. When you go off and write it in a separate language, there can be benefits, such as having a team, like a QA team, that writes the test for all the applications in one language or that kind of thing. But then you sort of dissociate yourself from the product developers. So it can go either way. You can choose a language that's just really good to write tests in. So there are certain product languages that wouldn't be very good to write tests in. So Objective-C was kind of a really good example of this. Now there's Swift, and so this is sort of less true. But there are instances where the language that you write the product in would just be very difficult to write tests in. And then lastly, you can just sort of go with the approach of, use whatever the hell you feel like. I haven't seen that work, but that is also a choice that you can make, and it may make sense for someone. So if you just have a lot of developers and they all know one language, you want them all to write tests, I suppose that's a choice. But I frequently find tying it to the language that your application is written in is generally the best approach because you will get the most involvement from everyone. The next thing to think about is how and when you'll run your tests. So will they be run before each commit? Will they be run before each integration, each release? What suites are run when? These are things that you should have sort of discussed and agreed upon throughout your company so you know that these tests run at these times and these tests run at these times and these are the kind of bugs that they're expected to find. So it makes a lot of sense to run unit tests before you push a commit. It makes a bit less sense to run some other kinds of tests then and so forth. And then lastly, how will they interface with your product? So if you're going to need to have some custom testability code into your product, it's good to know that up front. I talked to some people at Spotify, and this is what they do. The QA, the people who write the tests, send them a spec for all the different things they'll need to test the features, and they just implement it alongside. So they send them basically a header file and say, we need these methods to work. And then when the product comes out, they get that interface to test into it. So they don't use a tool like Appium, which just works without putting anything in your app. They put some stuff in their app, and it works well for them. But you can also go with something like Appium, which is detached from and works with generally any app without changing or putting any special test hooks in it. How will you track the results is very important. So who is responsible for investigating the failures? Who monitors the tests? And what happens when it's failing due to a product bug? It's not good to have tests that just are always failing. I think that's the #1 complaint we have with tests is that there's always them failing because the product's not fixed. So there are strategies to deal with that sort of thing. There are tools where you can flag them as investigated and tie them to product bugs and things of that nature. But these are the kind of things you should discuss it with your organization going in. Which metrics are important is also good. How are you going to track your automation? Because pass-fail is sort of really, really like the lowest level you can do. Code coverage is a useful tool for sort of seeing what you have and haven't automated. Use with care because just because you've covered the code doesn't mean you've tested everything. But it can be very, very helpful for finding where and what areas of your app are completely untested by your test automation. There's the pass rate. In some cases, 100% isn't always the kind of pass rate you look for. So they're sort of non-deterministic things. When I worked at the dating site, we had a matching algorithm. And that's not the kind of thing where you put in Fred, Sam, and Harry, and you get back the same people every time. It's a machine learning algorithm. It's non-deterministic, right? So in that case, a pass rate of 100% was never going to happen. So we had to develop different strategies to test it, which I won't go into in this talk. But there are scenarios such as that where maybe 80% of them passing makes sense, something like that. Execution time is a really important metric. Developers need immediate feedback on the quality of their code. And as execution time goes up, the sort of value of the feedback goes down. Because it's very useful if you tell me right after I worked on something that I broke it. But if you tell me 4 hours later, less useful. And certainly if you tell me 2 weeks later, it's not useful at all. And then lastly, who will maintain your tests? So you need to allocate time for test maintenance. And you need to understand that with every test you add to your test suite, you need to add a commitment to maintain that test. And what this will do is it will force you to get rid of tests that aren't that valuable or aren't that useful or that are just too expensive. So with unit tests, this doesn't happen so much because they run so quickly. But with end-to-end tests, you'll frequently find yourself wanting to reconfigure and prune your suite so that you aren't taking a week to give people feedback. Or combining situations with that kind of thing as well. So the maintenance grows with the tests. So also you should think about how you're going to track the health of your tests. How are you going to deprecate and retire tests? And how do you deal with flaky and unreliable tests? So some advice from me on flaky and unreliable tests. I find that you take the ones that are the most flaky, the ones that are the coin flip, and you start with those, and you investigate those. And if you can fix those guys, then there's value. And if you can't, they were basically a coin flip anyway. So you may as well just get rid of them. So it's quite easy. The ones I find are more difficult to deal with are the 98% pass rate ones, or the 99%, because they basically work all the time. But then there's that one thing you can never figure out as to why they break. So they do have value, but at the same time, they sort of undermine your whole ability to tell people how good is the app when they just sort of hear wolf being cried all the time by your tests. Anyways, so moving on. I'll talk now about making your user interface accessible and the link between accessibility and automatability. So with most of the automation frameworks out there, they just hook into the accessibility features of the operating systems or platforms they run on. Selenium is sort of a different case, but with Appium and with other tools out there, that's the way they work. So just a quick overview if you've never done this before. In iOS, you have a few different properties. You have what's called the accessibility identifier, and that will be used for the purposes of UI automation. So I've actually found out, I always wondered what it was for, and someone told me that you can actually, with voice commands, use this to trigger things. I've never actually done it, but that's what that's apparently there for. So just a note, it is sort of used by something, but not really. There's also the accessibility label, which is what will be read to people using assistive devices. And there's the hint, which just adds a little more context. So we recommend with a tool like Appium, you want to use the accessibility identifier because that's going to interfere the least with people using assistive devices. And it will give you a way to reliably identify your user interface. So there's 3 ways to set it. They're all equally valid, I suppose. So if you look in the accessibility inspector, you can set the identifier there in your Zib or your storyboard. You can also set it programmatically. So there are methods and properties that you can modify in Swift or Objective-C. And then you can also use a user-defined runtime attribute, which is probably the worst way to do it. But in some cases, this is the only way it works. And I won't go into sort of the details of why these scenarios exist. But you will find that this is sort of the sledgehammer approach to making something show its accessibility ID in Appium. Some troubleshooting tips for iOS and Appium. You may need to look at parent elements. There are properties such as accessibility elements hidden in is accessibility element. So if your parent in the UI has accessibility elements hidden, it's not going to show the children in the accessibility DOM, and you won't be able to access them. This is put there for certain kinds of controls where the children elements don't really make sense in the DOM, but you may find that something you add underneath inherits this. And also, you can take something out from being an accessibility element. So this is something that iOS does really well. There's all sorts of grouping views and views that serve more organizational purposes than actual UI purposes or actual interface purposes. If you've ever seen an Android in Appium, the DOM tree gets quite deep. And that's because they don't do what iOS does here and have this ability to make something not appear in the accessibility DOM. Though we have a nifty trick in Appium where we can sort of compress and hide those out. Yeah, and the last thing, there is a protocol that any accessible element needs to implement. So there's a few random pieces of UI that don't use the UI accessibility protocol, which means they won't show up as being a UI element. So you may need to add that protocol if you have some custom UI and you inherit from something that doesn't use it. I can't think off the top of my head which iOS elements do this. I think like the pill view controller where you switch is one of them where it doesn't have this. And so frequently people say, I can't select the pill in iOS. And all you have to do is make a class that derives from it and then add that protocol in and it will work. And then lastly, there's sort of the order of importance. So if you set it programmatically, that will override any runtime attributes. And runtime attributes will override what's in the storyboard of the zip file. So just so you know, if you see ones showing up that aren't what you expect, check the order of sort of inheritance on these things. Because if someone sets it in the code, it'll wipe out the other. And if someone sets it in a runtime attribute, it'll overwrite what's in the storyboard, and so on. For Android, it's much simpler. You just set the property in Android Studio or in the XML. You can set the ID. It's quite simple. So, well, not a long, lengthy explanation like there's for iOS. As for web content, we always like to say use IDs if you can. With modern web applications and the idea that IDs must be globally unique, this can be problematic. So it's perfectly acceptable to also use CSS selectors. And if you want to decouple it from your styling, you could also use data-attributes. All these are equally valid and should basically be found at comparable speeds. I've read articles that go back and forth, what's faster, CSS selectors, XPath, and so forth. I don't know what the current state of that is, but in general, you're not going to go wrong using any of these three. And then lastly, just to call out to XPath, there are things that you can do with it that you can't do with CSS selectors, so that might be the only case where I'd recommend you using XPath. Someone mentioned you can walk up the DOM with it. I haven't personally done that, but I have searched for text within elements, which you can't do with a CSS selector. So that's something you might want to do. But you shouldn't be searching for text of elements to find things. But sometimes you get handed a product and you can't change it, and you have to do something like that. All right. So another important thing is to make your larger scenarios more efficient to automate. So it's just the general dry principle. Don't repeat yourself. So I see a lot of people write tests, and they couple their actions into these libraries. And then when they run sets of Selenium tests or Appium tests, every single test is walking through the entire app to do absolutely everything. So when I started at Zeusk, we had Selenium automation, and every script filled out the registration form to get an account to then run an actual test, which is crazy. And I would think it was an anomaly, but I've seen a lot of places where this happens. And you really shouldn't do this. I understand that, like, in some places you have apps that you can't go and retrofit for automation, but this talk is sort of about not retrofitting, but actually the opposite of retrofitting. So don't put yourself in that situation where you have to do that. So the pros of this approach, if you want to say, it's easy, it's lazy, just to do that. It thoroughly covers scenarios, so I don't think we ever had a problem with the registration flow because every single effing test ran through it. It did make our test suite a lot slower. And it's actually similar to what a user would do, I suppose. You could argue that. The cons are, I mean, it's slow, and then with UI automation, obviously, the more buttons you click and things you do, the more fragility and brittleness you inject into the suite. So I understand that sometimes it's sort of the only option. This is something I have to deal with some payment providers we use where I work now, where we can't go in and sort of make a test account in an API or that kind of thing. But it should sort of be that last resort to approach the problem that way. I really recommend making APIs explicitly for testing. So as I mentioned earlier with the guys at Spotify, what they do is the test team tells the developers an interface of what they're going to need to test the product. And I think that's the ideal scenario, where you have an API that's just for testing. So in most mobile apps, you have a REST API living in the cloud somewhere. And that's the perfect place to put a lot of it. So obviously, you don't want to expose it to everyone, but you can make methods in there that will shortcut your ability to get to different states and test them. You may not even actually have to add different ones, because for mobile apps, a lot of the changes happen with REST API calls anyway. So they may already be there, but then there may be some you need to add. So some examples of that be like when I worked for Zeusk, we had to do things like set someone's balance to a certain number. So there's no REST API that just sets people's balances. That's silly. So in the test API, we had that, where we could test some of the scenarios where people don't have enough money for one thing but have enough for another, that kind of thing. That would be much. You definitely don't want to go through the UI automation approach and automate, like, buying virtual currency and then making sure it's in the right state and that sort of thing. But that's also something you would never have in your REST API, just the ability to set someone's balance. But it's something we put in the test API, which is quite useful. So whatever you do, don't expose this externally. This is just for testing. I've never had that problem, but I just felt like I need to call it out. Another important thing to sort of consider around scaling up your ability to write more and more tests is sharing code. So you should talk about what's your code sharing strategy and how you're going to split up your project so that you can share code efficiently. So doing this will reduce the amount of time it takes to write a new test. And it'll also add robustness. So it's just general good programming. If there's something you do over and over again, you put it in a subroutine or a function or a method, right? And your test should be the same way. So there should only be one place that does that thing. And when that thing changes, you just change it in the one place. And you should formulate a strategy around how you're going to separate these and put them together so that you can share and get off the ground more quickly. So the nice thing here is if you do this in a way and everyone's aware of it, when someone else has to write a test, they know exactly where to look for all the things that have already been done, and they can leverage those to get off and moving very quickly. And another thing I'd like to really encourage is when possible, don't reinvent the wheel. And this is a bit hypocritical on my part, as Appium is sort of the reinvention of the wheel, I suppose. But I would strongly encourage you to always look for existing tools and plugins that save you time. Because for one, someone else is going to maintain them, which saves you a lot of time. But two, they tend to be better than what you could do in a reasonable amount of time because they'll have large groups of people working on them. So they're all common problems that we all face writing tests. And so I would really encourage you to bring in other people's things and write your own sparingly. So everywhere I've worked, someone always writes their own logging engine. And then there's so many great logging tools out there. And they'll spend 5-6 days writing a logging engine when they could have just, added it to the package JSON and been done with it. And then future-proof. For years, they would get all the updates to Winston or whatever, right? Anyway, another important thing to consider is resetting the state between your tests. So how quickly can you get your product back into a known good state? So with mobile, you frequently have this decoupling where you have a server that's responsible for the state and the mobile app client, which is usually what you're testing. And when you make changes, they tend to persist on the server because it doesn't get rebooted with your Appium test, right? You may wipe the phone and put a fresh copy of the app on, but the server's still there. So you need to think about how you're going to get that server back to a good state. And can you avoid the problem altogether? Because it's a really nasty problem to try and tackle. And the golden goose, can you quickly destroy a whole version of your server and recreate it for every test? So where I work now, we have this. It's beautiful. So for every test, we can spin up a server, spin it down. It's beautiful. So no state is leaked, and it always starts the exact same way. So if you're starting from the very beginning, plan for this sort of thing. And the last topic I'm really going to talk about is concurrency. So this is SauceCon. So concurrency, I think, is one of the big things that you get from Sauce. The big two things, I think, would be configuration management, the ability to ask Sauce for any ancient device, any configuration in the cloud you want, and have it at your fingertips in a matter of seconds. And the other being to have an army of that at your disposal quite easily. So if you're at this conference, concurrency should interest you. And it's something that it's very difficult to retrofit for if you shoot yourself in the foot initially. So think about the shared application state. So I'll throw out some interesting examples in a moment. But what operations have side effects? So for some products, there's no state, right? They're stateless. So if you interact with the server, it doesn't change anything. But for most products, it's not the case. When you interact with the server, you change some piece of state that may then make another test not act the way it's supposed to. And you need to be aware of what are all your side effects and how are you going to mitigate them with your tests. Also, you need to think about what parts of your infrastructure can be shared between concurrent tests without conflicts. So there's all sorts of interesting things I've seen crop up here. But if you think about when two tests run at the same time, what resources might they hit at the same time and what problems may occur? So a classic example of this is we had tests that tested banning people from the dating site I worked at. And when you ban someone, our system blocks their IP, their email address, and all sorts of things. So the unfortunate thing is our test cluster does use the same IP every now and then, and it would get added to the block list. And even if it was just for that test where we verify they can't log in, there's still a period where that IP is blocked, and there may be other ones talking to it. So that's an example of sort of leaking state between two tests. So you wouldn't really think we block the account, but then we go in and we block a whole lot of other things as well. And we do reset it at the end of the test, but there are sort of knock-on side effects for other tests. So also think about your bottlenecks. So this is another one I see a lot. Tests that have other tests as prerequisites. So has anyone seen this before? Show of hands. It's, it's sad, but this should never, never, ever, ever happen. It's one test if it has a prerequisite. It's one really long test. That's the classic example. Another bottleneck is sort of a fixed number of environments. So a lot of people don't have the ability to just spin up another copy of their server whenever they'd like. And so they have 4 or 5 test environments, and they have to find and share them as they can. So that can work, and I've worked in places where I've had to do that. And there are ways to sort of make the tests aware of what they can use while the tests are using it and that kind of thing. But it is a lot of work. If you're starting from scratch, I really recommend you go in with the ability to, either with Docker or with something, just spin up your server in a very small place so that each test can have its own fresh copy. And another bottleneck can be where you have to wait for asynchronous events or eventual consistency or things that sort of happen later. So I register, and then I get the, oh, you didn't validate your email 10 minutes later. And I've seen people write that test where they sleep for 10 minutes, and they wait for that email to come. Don't do this. This is a good example of when maybe you add a test API that just changes the queue time on that email or something, and then it comes out immediately, and so forth. So anyways, or also you could just check queues or something like that instead of actually checking that it's written to the data store. Surely there's an integration test that when I put an item in a queue, it eventually writes to the data store or something. That's probably the correct way to test that, and not with an end-to-end test. So anyways, some examples of collision. I think I talked about one earlier. I see a lot of tests that try and change the date on the server to trigger some sort of random leap day or whatever they want to test. Don't do those tests. Do those as unit tests where you can mock the component. That's the correct way to do that. Don't change something like that on the server with an end-to-end test. That's a classic example of what unit tests are for. I talked about the blocking IP address one earlier. And another one I see a lot is you'll have a test that tests some boundary condition or some overflow condition, and it'll just bring the server to its knees, and that'll be running alongside another test. So that's another example where you can sort of collide unintentionally. So you'll have something where it tries to trigger the heat limit or the fraud limit or something, and then it locks everything out or something like that. So be wary of all that stuff. And also, sometimes people check that state's set in a common place. Like, I open a support request, but there may be other tests that open support requests. And then I don't know where it is in the queue and that kind of thing. So try not to do these sorts of things. So tips for isolating. Holy grail, one environment, one test. If you can do that, amazing. If you can't, find the dimensions by which you can divide your tests. So IP addresses was sort of a dimension for some of the fraud testing we were doing. We know we have so many IPs. We know that if we have a test that blocks an IP, no other test can use that IP at the same time. So you have the idea of having sort of dimensions or resources that you can check out for a test and then check back in. I find that a lot of people build that kind of infrastructure. Another thing I've seen people do is split things up by regions. So they'll have like tests that run in different postal codes or something like that where they know that that postal code is reserved for that test. So once again, ideally you can just spin up an environment or create all the accounts or all the whatevers you need to run the test. But if you can't, that's a nice workaround. And as I mentioned that earlier. So your runtime should not be linear to the number of tests that you write. If that's the case, you're doing it wrong. And what I mean by that is you should have a nice testing infrastructure where you can add more and more tests and it doesn't double the runtime for double the amount of tests. So a tool like Sauce is great for that, but there are other things you can do as well. So if you're starting from scratch, it should not linearly increase to add a test. And like I mentioned, Kubernetes is another tool I'll plug, a great tool for doing this sort of thing, and Docker as well, and then Sauce Labs, of course. I'm running out of time. So I will sum it all up. I have 30 seconds to tell you what I've tried to tell you today. So if you're going to make your app automatable, there's a few things you need to do. So talk about the culture, iron out how you're going to automate stuff, who's responsible for what, and how it's going to work. Make your apps accessible so that UI automation tools can access them. Make it more efficient for your larger scenarios. Add test APIs. Put certain kinds of tests in unit tests. And make easy ways to get to good states and to reset your server to a good state. And lastly, plan for concurrency. Don't shoot yourself in the foot. think about this test is going to have to play nice with all the other children. So either I need to indicate the ways in which it doesn't play nice and work around them, or build a system where they can all go play in their own sandbox. And that is all I have for today. So if you have any questions, I think I have this time allotted for questions, right? No, it does not. Okay. Little time. Oh no, back there.
I've got a good testing scenario for you. It's about the clock, and don't ever change the system clock. So my 11-year-old just discovered an iPad game that he really likes, and you have to wait 24 hours to earn another pot of gold. He's discovered that if he changes the system clock to tomorrow, he gets that pot of gold now. And apparently the game developers apparently never tested for that. So I'm curious, how would you deal with that scenario if you were on that game team?
How would you deal with that scenario? I would not trust the user's system clock. I would use the server system clock, and then you wouldn't have that problem. The kid would have to hack the server. Good question, though. This one.
Yes, so I drive the end-to-end team for Yahoo. And one way we deal with the concurrency issue that you mentioned for our test, which the UI front end we like to run as many times as possible. And our backend side, we check once a day. So whenever our front end side runs, we write out the timestamps and the events that we collect. And our backend test kicks in, reads from that file, and verifies whether all those events, based on number of times that the test was run in a day, that if we receive all of them. So
Okay.
that's how we separate.
So this is like the
out
wait
tests.
10 minutes to get an email solution.
Yeah.
Don't wait, and then have a follow-on job that then goes back and checks.
Yeah, we have 4 steps of tests, and each are set to run at a different time.
Yeah,
So
I think
we
that's a
can-
very useful suggestion for some people. If I give this talk again, I'll probably add it.
Okay, thank you.
There's one back.
One. So you mentioned Kubernetes for doing some stuff in isolation and being able to kind of spin up environments. We're thinking about doing some of the same stuff at T-Mobile, but one of my questions is have you ever used a container solution to test in isolation for an app that doesn't necessarily go to production in a container? And have you seen issues with that if you have?
Oh, that's a good question. So my current position, we have services that run in production in containers and in dev in containers. So mixing them, I imagine you could see issues, but I don't have any experience with it, but it's entirely possible. All right, I guess I'm out of time.
All right, thanks, Dan. Excellent.